Hello, everyone. I'm Cheryl Crooks, Executive Director of Cascadia International Women's Film Festival. Cascadia is entering its 5th season this year of showing exceptional films directed by women from all over the world. I want to welcome you to this very special conversation with Director Martha Wheelock and Jill Bernstein of the League of Women Voters here in Bellingham and Whatcom County. Martha directed the short documentary film Inez Milholland, Forward into the Light, which was presented by Cascadia online in celebration of the Centennial of the 19th Amendment. The film is about Inez Milholland, and it's an especially important film this year because of the Centennial of the 19th Amendment, and also because it is an election year. Milholland literally gave her life for the right for women to vote, and she sparked the first protests in front of the White House. She brought the issue of women's suffrage front and center, and eventually it led to the ratification of the 19th Amendment on August 18th, 1920. The amendment was signed into law August 26th, 1920. Cascadia is celebrating the centennial of this important historical event this year. Martha will talk to you about the film Inez Milholland and her efforts as a filmmaker to bring the stories of women like Milholland to light. She has directed 18 films and has taught women's history courses. We're pleased to have as our moderator Jill Bernstein, who chaired the Centennial Committee for our local League of Women Voters and also spent 3 decades as a criminal defense attorney. We want to thank all of Cascadia's festival sponsors this year, including the City of Bellingham, Whatcom County, KCTS, the Mary Redmond Foundation, and Eileen and Steve Nelson. The festival would not be possible without their generous support. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy this conversation.
Well, Martha, welcome to Bellingham, Washington. We're so glad to have you with us.
Wow. Well, I wish I were there. It's a beautiful spot.
At least in August, it really is. Hey, Martha, first question for you is, why did you choose Inez as your subject? As Cheryl said, you've done 18 films about women. What was it that made Inez special and made you decide to make her the subject of this film?
Well, welcome everybody. This is a great day for us women all around the country of this ratification in Tennessee in 1920. We can tell you a little bit more about that later. But the answer to the question about Inez Milholland, many people saw the poster of the white horse and the woman in a Joan of Arc outfit leading this marvelous very first parade to ever come down, or march I'd like to call it, down Pennsylvania Avenue. And she was spectacular. She just made a tremendous image, but her name was never really known. The woman on the white horse, the Joan of Arc, the new woman, all of those kinds of terms were used. And I didn't know her name really, or even anything more about her. But I then was captured as I. And there's several reasons that I am I still on? Oh,
yes.
that I really fell in love with her. I became obsessed with her actually. First of all, was the image of this brave woman, this courageous woman, the new woman, as they would call her at the beginning of the 20th century. A new woman in that case meant that she wanted to have a life run by her own rules. And Inez was very controversial. She was a pacifist. She worked on the Henry Ford ship to try to prevent World War I. She was a socialist. She was well, I guess you'd say a free lovist. By that, I mean she had an open marriage. She married a foreigner, which was also whom she asked to marry. And she was a rebel rouser from the very beginning. Her parents were very socially conscious. Her father was the founder, one of the founders of the NAACP. Inez was an early member of the NAACP. The family.
Well, so Martha, you found a lot about her life that was non-traditional.
Yes.
And that was what attracted you to her. So let's break that down just a little bit. You know, whenever we read anything about her, including in your film, all of those clippings about her, comment on her physical beauty and her clothing. And I was sort of struck by that. I've gone back to read a little bit about Inez, and she is never mentioned without people talking about her physical appearance. And what was it about her physical appearance that became such an important detail of her public persona?
And actually a selling point, a branding for her. Well, you know, the suffragists were considered old maids. Nobody would marry them. They were ugly. They had hair on their faces. They were They were not at all something that you'd want to follow and abide by their rights. That's what the anti-suffragists painted as the suffragists. So here we have this very educated, young woman. She wasn't an old hag like you know, Susan B. Anthony and all of the other reputations that came through, but she was a young, vital person, and the beauty was sort of marketed. She was marketed that way, and so the men would come to hear her speak because they wanted to see this beautiful, beautiful woman, dramatic. She was a dramatic person from Vassar. She had a presence and a bearing, and she was a confident woman.
Well, one could say that she was sort of the Gloria Steinem then of her age.
Yes.
Played off against the Bella Abzug. So the woman who is more physically attractive becomes the spokesmodel for the cause.
Right. Perfect. Perfect. Yeah. And then I found out that she did a lot. Not only was it the 1913 march, but she led two marches, big marches in New York State, New York City in 1912, and then again in 1913, all on horseback. She was that kind of the figure you could not get out of your mind. And then, of course, as the film tells you, I follow her through her Western tour. She was sent out. They could publicize her well. They could draw people to come to her lectures because she was the most beautiful suffragist. And
now you mentioned in passing in the film, and you mentioned in passing in your opening comments that Inez was a member of the NAACP, and we know that racial conflict is an important part of the story of the passage of the 19th Amendment. What was Inez's position about that conflict, and how did that set her with or against Alice Paul and some of the other women involved in the movement?
Well, when Alice Paul wanted or thought that the Black women should march at the end of the parade, it was because they were marching with her Howard University, and all of the universities were marching then. But Alice had to pander to the Southern women's vote and the Southern men's vote, and try to get this through as a cause. And Inez says, "I will not lead this parade if you will not let the Black women march." And so Alice had to just kind of ignore her initial warning to the Black women, and they ended up marching. So Alice and Inez. That's the first incident I know. I know another very touching story when Inez collapses in Los Angeles. Alice Paul wrote to her and said, "No, Inez, just pick yourself up and keep on going. Keep on going. You can keep on going. You're our envoy." And Alice had no tolerance for somebody who might get sick with pernicious anemia.
Well, how about being unconscious and in the hospital? That wasn't a good enough excuse.
Right. No, I mean, so Alice was a real ball buster, I think.
You know, the fight for suffrage in the United States was 72 years. It's a generations long fight with a lot of setbacks. And we know that women were fighting each other and fraying their resources. We had Alice Paul at odds with Carrie Chapman Catt. We had different factions, the women of color not working in concert with the white women. and we could argue that it was similar, this fraying of resources, even though they were working towards the same goal, is similar to what played out in the differing paths taken by Malcolm X and Martin Luther King.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, what can we learn from all of this, from this infighting that went on in the suffrage movement, and what can we learn from that to help make our political work today more effective?
Well, I think we need all points of view when there is a movement of this magnitude. And it took both the Cat point of view of having tea with the president, of being ladylike still and wanting not to cause any trouble, because that attracted a huge group of women who didn't believe in nonviolent direct action, who were of an older generation, the genteel generation. And then there was Alice Paul, who attracted people by notoriety and notice. So we needed both of them. And when the ratification happened, if Cat's winning plan hadn't been in place, the states wouldn't have been behind the ratification as quickly as they were. So what can we learn from that? We can learn we can have coalition building. We can all keep our eye on a prize, and there's bound to be tactical differences as to the way forces will work. But I think it's important to see how they can talk to one another, because they had a larger than their individual arguments were, something that stretched over everything. And they got through it. I mean, it's really amazing how they got through it. Not necessarily easily, but they stuck in there and they listened to each other. And I had a scene when Cat and Paul met at one time. They agreed to disagree, but they at least heard what the other person was going to do, so that there was no surprises. There was nothing that was going to cause an embarrassment of unknown. The Cat was very embarrassed by Alice Paul and her behavior, but she understood what it was about her.
Well, there's a lot to be, from that time embarrassed about. I mean,
Yeah.
The protests that you mentioned that happened out in front of the White House led to imprisonments.
Mm-hmm.
They led to not only to force feedings, to loss of family, to all sorts of drama in the streets. And not only was this unladylike, this was just simply unheard of.
Yeah.
And so this was sort of a big deal in terms of Alice Paul, her faction and their tactics being completely at odds with not just Carrie Chapman Catt and her generational difference. I mean, this is at odds with how women were supposed to behave in
Right.
public, right? This is a big deal.
Yeah.
These were I read today, these were the first protests in front of the White House.
Mm-hmm.
This is what sparked the notion of standing in front of the White House.
Right. They were the first pickets. They were the first group imprisoned and arrested for doing that as well. And as I said before, they were the suffragists were the first to have a huge parade, a huge march down Pennsylvania Avenue. There was one other group, a little army group that did it before that, about 10 years before that. But this is the first recorded public march down Pennsylvania Avenue.
Even as women were working for suffrage, there were other women working against them and working against the vote. And yet suffragists believed that when women got the vote, they were going to vote as a bloc and they were going to cure social ills. They were just wrong, weren't they?
Yeah, they were just wrong, yeah.
But
today.
any opinion as to why this didn't happen the way they were imagining it would happen?
Well, I think that's where we bring in Carrie Chapman Catt and the League of Women Voters, that they probably vote. Some of them still voted the way their husbands did. Some of them had no idea what voting was all about. They were not educated along that line, and that's and I'm sure you could tell a little bit about the League of Women Voters, why that was created for that reason. And then we had, I don't know how many of the viewers here saw Mrs. America. We had this exact same thing happening over the ERA and Phyllis Schlafly. And there will be women who do not vote for their best interest. And or they think it's not. They think it is their best interest, but it takes a while to really open up a lot of those closed doors, those avenues of propriety, let's say, or what they've always done in the past. It takes a great deal of courage to think for yourself.
Well, you mentioned that Inez was a free thinker. What did that term mean? What did that connote about her?
Well, as a lawyer, for example, there was she took up the rights of women who were being beaten by their husbands, and she initiated new laws, helped initiate new laws in New York City for some kind of property rights that a woman who was going through divorce, especially from sexual abuse. She worked, a very touching thing about Inez is that she married a Dutchman. And in those times, the law was that if a American woman married a foreigner, she lost her American citizenship. So even if she had been alive at the time of the vote, she still could not have voted. So she worked for a cause that she was not even going to benefit from. Soon afterwards, with the help of a woman named Crystal Eastman, who was a co-author of the ERA and one of the great legal reformers of our country, there finally was a return to that law, and I think it has changed now. I'm pretty sure it's changed. But
well, yes, we don't, as Americans, lose our citizenship if we marry a man who is not from the U.S. That's true. That law has changed.
Yeah.
But, in your film, you make it a point of saying that she went west. Inez went west on this speaking tour to try to get the women of the West who already had the vote to vote against Wilson and to vote against the Democrats. Mm-hmm. Any thought as to why, what have you learned in your research as to why the vote happened in the West first?
Well, they were it was an untamed territory. The men really could not have done as much settling of the West if it hadn't been for their wives and their children. Both Washington and in California in 1911, we won the vote here in Washington. You won it a year before us. But the men really respected the hardworking nature of the women, and they needed they used the vote to attract women to come out when the ratio was 1 woman to 8 men in Wyoming. And they also were a lot more, unbounded by urban patriarchal values. They were pioneers. The women out here were pioneers with their husbands on a very equal footing. And so Inez came out here because all of the real Western states the women could vote. They could vote in 1912 for the presidential election. And it was called Hold the Party in Power Responsible for What You Want. So if the Democrats were not for suffrage, we have to get rid of them. It's interesting that it was the Republican Party who were the most sympathetic and the most supportive of women's right to vote.
Well, Wilson came around eventually. He saw which side his bread was buttered on, you could say. And he was convinced, both inside of the White House, the people working on the inside, and the noise that was happening in the street, right?
Yeah, right. But very late he came around for all the years that they were working from 1912 when he was elected.
He was a hard sell.
He was, yes.
But those women in the street were causing great consternation. I mean, like we were saying, this was unheard of, to be standing there with picket signs and saying so pointedly at him, when will we get our liberty?
And at one point they had a sign that said Kaiser Wilson. And they embarrassed him by talking to the Russian envoys who came to talk about the end of the war by saying, you know what, you Russians, your women are more liberated than we are. We have something like what did he say? 80 million women who don't have the vote here and so forth. It wasn't 80 million, what, 8 million? Can't remember the number, but they embarrassed him tremendously.
You know, there was drama at every turn. There was drama when Inez falls unconscious on the stage while asking for liberty. And then there's drama at the final vote in Tennessee as the final votes are being counted. Can you talk a little bit about what happened in Tennessee on the 18th of August, 1920?
Well, it was a very hot day, such as today, very hot, over 100 in Tennessee. And they'd had several back and forths about whether the bill should be postponed or not. And if you postpone a bill like that to ratify, it really meant that it was not going to pass. And the Senate had passed it barely. And all of the women, Mrs. Catt and the Women's Party were all there trying to figure out who was going to be the one. There was a tie. What legislator could they work against? And there was the youngest congressman was Harry Byrne from the eastern part of Tennessee, Mimin County, and he was a young kid, so he kind of like stuck with the big guys that wanted him to vote against suffrage, and he wore a red rose, which meant that he was anti-suffrage. The suffragist people wore a gold rose or yellow rose. And he was all ready to vote against suffrage ratification. And he gets a letter from his mother, Feb Byrne. Now, Feb was a very educated, property-holding widow. And she had to train the men who worked for her. And was very upset that they could vote for her property tax. And she was the one that was paying them. So she writes him a little newsy letter, and then at the end he says, now be a good boy and help Mrs. Catt put the rat in ratification. Vote for suffrage. And he put the letter in his pocket and he went off to the State House. And they very quietly go down the row of who's going to vote. They get to Harry. He takes the red rose off of his lapel and he puts it down and he says, "Aye," very softly. And the place went into uproar. So it really was a vote of by one vote that it was ratified on this date.
You know, there's drama at every turn, but it took a lot of people from different walks of life in order to push this across the finish line. Inez's background was one we could call of privilege, right? She came from money. And what role did that have in shaping her, do you think?
Excuse me. Well, her family had money at most turns, but then her father was an inventor of the pneumatic tube, which were the tubes that sent the mail underground so they didn't have to have post people. And it was a failure in New York City. So they had money sometimes and not all the time. But she was educated. I think that's the greatest privilege for her. Even though it was a hard haul to get her law degree. But I think that money allowed her, and her father basically paid for her trip to go west, allowed her to have the freedom to work. And that's what we have to think about as people who have funds to be able to fund people to go out and do the work in the streets or themselves, have the liberty to do that. But she never was haughty. She always had the little guy in her orb, and of course women for sure. She worked hard against a man who was ready to die in Sing Sing prison, who was innocent. She did a lot of pro bono work. So I think it gave her the latitude to do that type of thing.
So you started off by saying Inez had been sort of ignored, except as the woman on the horse. And in the movie Iron Jawed Angels, she's barely a blip on the screen. And
right.
One of our participants is asking a really good question. You know, don't you think Iron Jawed Angels should have shined a brighter light on her? And don't you think that you know, more than Alice Paul should have been yes. featured in that and in this histories that were being told about suffrage.
Yeah, and of course, unfortunately, that film has a lot of wonderful art direction that's very accurate, but the story of Alice Paul is not accurate. She never had a boyfriend. She never took a bath by herself. She never did. If you know what I mean. Let's see. And Inez was just, as you said, a blip. But it is unfortunate, and I think that's why I wanted to make this film, because there were the ones that Alice Paul appointed that did a lot of work, that did the spectacular. One of Alice Paul's great sayings was, if you want to make progress, you have to create a spectacle. Create a spectacle. And it was always nonviolent, direct action. It was never, ever vicious, but it was spectacular. And all the bad press that Alice Paul got in 1913 and all of the press that Inez garnered was what Alice Paul lived on and lived for. And the movement did too.
Well, you mentioned that they traded off of her physical appearance,
Yeah.
her glamour self, but she was used in much the same way that cars were used by the movement. How were cars used?
Well, in the early Western states, for example, in earlier, like 1910 and 1911, the car was just a novelty. It wasn't very prominent. And out in the West, it was necessary, much more so than in the urban cities of New York and Washington. But the men we were told, a Packard Blue Liner's coming to your town. Come out and see this brand new car. And on the back seat would be two suffragists ready to burn their ears off with votes for women. But they didn't know that. They came to see the car, and then they actually were kind of interested. They got pulled in and they got to touch the car and they got to see what it was all about. It was a 9-passenger car, the ones that they used out here. Beautiful bright blue liner by Packard.
So the cars and the pretty women were then used as a magnet to get men to attend speeches they otherwise might have ignored.
Oh yeah. Who wants to go hear speeches about women?
It's a question that we've been exploring through the ages, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned that her greatest privilege was education, Inez's greatest privilege, but she also came from a family that cared about social issues, right?
Yeah,
they had a lot of people of wealth were focused on, we'll call it cleaner culture, contribute your money to the art museum and so forth. How is her family different than that?
Well, her father and mother had a big old house that they made even bigger to bring in orphans and people, I guess, and students from Brooklyn, Black students, and they created a summer school there. I've been there. It was wonderful. It was like living in a big dorm. They taught them all sorts of things, and it's now a beautiful music school up in the Adirondack Mountains. So they were always keeping their eye open for how they could give back to the community and enrich the community. And when I was in her father's hometown of Lewis, New York, he was like the fairy godfather, He was somebody who had earned a very big reputation of philanthropy.
So besides the story that you tell about Inez, have other of your 18 films focused on women similar to her? Are there any films that you'd like our audience of yours to explore or to know about?
I started my film career doing a film on the author May Sarton, who is known more on the East Coast than here, a very broad author, wonderful author. And then I made a couple of other films about Kate Chopin from the South, a short story writer. And that's because there were no films or books really written about women authors at that time. I'm a rather advanced aged woman. So at that time, nobody even read authors of the feminine gender, female gender. And so from there, but my first thing was that I marched in the 1970 First Women's March down Fifth Avenue for the 50th anniversary of women getting the vote. And I was spellbound. I said, I've got to learn more about this movement. And there was Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem and Belle Abzug, and this is New York City. And they thought they were going to get about 50 people in line. And it took over, it was maybe 25, 30,000 women for the very first march that we had here for the for the vote. And then I became attracted so much to suffrage that I made my first film on the 75th anniversary of it. It's called Votes for Women. I made a film on how California women won the vote in 1911, 9 years before the rest of the country. I just finished a film called Finding Justice, which is the story of the Justice Bell in Pennsylvania in 1915. The women there made a replica of the Liberty Bell. And it's on the top of the bell, it said it's established justice. They put it on an old Stanley steamer truck, and they drove it 5,000 miles around every county in Pennsylvania in the summer of 1915. They worked their little tails off. They were in white dresses, and it was muddy and rainy and everything. But they would get up on the truck, and they would talk about suffrage in all these towns with no microphones, no street lights. They just carried this bell. They wanted, and the clapper was tied so it could only move once the women got the vote. Alas, they lost by 65,000 votes in 1915 with 3 other states in the East Coast. 1915 was a terrible year, and that's why they had to change the politics of not going state by state as Mrs. Catt wanted to do, but go for the jugular, go for the federal amendment. Those states aren't going to give us anything. It's like asking every Tom, Dick, and Harry on the corner for his opinion, and it doesn't matter. We just need to go to the higher realm and get that amendment.
Well, what if people want to see your movies? How can they best plug in and watch your films?
Oh, well, I have a very easy website. It's called wildwestwomen.org, and they're there, and be glad to have, there's little trailers of each one, or they can write me at martha@wildwestwomen.org if they have a question or they want to get something else. I love to get mail.
You know, I want to roll back to Inez for just a second here, and we talk about her coming from privilege, having the benefit of an education, but she has a pretty famous quote about that privilege, which is, "I am prepared to sacrifice every so-called privilege I possess in order to have a few rights." Yeah. That is a very important statement, isn't it?
Isn't it? Yeah, it's really telling of how little privilege meant to her in her search for the rightness of the cause. And this is why we love these women. They really didn't think of anything that they might have to put up with. You know, I think of Susan B. Anthony traveling hours and hours on trains to get to Kansas to do a speech in the middle of the night, you know, when things were really rugged. Inez is traveling of 50 speeches in 24 days in 11 states. She just kept going. She was dogged. She was so determined to hit every state in little towns and whatnot.
You know, it's that tenacity, I think, that we can really take a lesson from. And, you know, it's one thing to attend a march on an afternoon or even to spray paint graffiti with your message, but to get up the next day and continue to work and fight. And then when your fight doesn't get you what you want, to go back, rethink your strategy, and get up and do it again is really quite the marvel, isn't it?
Well, that was one of the things that you and I agreed on we could take away from the women's suffrage movement, that they were persistent, persevering, determined, never defeated. I was one of the captains of the creation of the big suffrage Centennial float in this year's Rose Parade. I'm very, very happy and proud to have done that. And the name of the float was called Years of Hope, Years of Courage. And I just wanted to say, hope is the driving energy, because if they hadn't had that hope, they wouldn't have, after that horrible defeat in 1915 with 4 states losing in the East Coast, they couldn't have gotten up the next morning. So
Well, I love a message of hope. And I also want us to remember that today is a day full of celebration. Today is the day when Tennessee passed the amendment for us, ratified it, and allowed all of us to be full participants in our democracy. Carrie Chapman Catt, who founded the League of Women Voters, was instrumental in all of this. And she believed, of course, not just that women should have the vote, but that every vote that was cast should be an educated vote. And we have a lot to be grateful for from her leadership. And she gave a beautiful speech upon ratification that ends with that message of hope and joy. And we'll finish up today by saying a little quote from Carrie, which is, "Women, be glad today. Let your voices ring out the gladness in your hearts. There will never come another day like this. Let the joy be unconfined, and let it speak so clearly that its echo will be heard around the world and find its way into the soul of every woman of any and every race and nationality who is yearning for opportunity and liberty still denied her sex." So in joy and in hope today, I say thank you, Martha. Thank you for the film, and thank you for joining us here in Bellingham.
and don't forget to vote.
Don't forget to vote. Thank you.
Yay. Thank you, Jill.